It's October, people are in the mood to talk scary movies, so today I'm going to share my top 6 favorite horror franchises of all time. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your favorite horror franchises of all time. My list is not the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. One more thing before we get started. This video is brought to you by my supporters over on Patreon. Every single month, I have them select a video for me to do on this channel. This month, they selected my favorite horror franchises of all time. If you're interested in more Sean Chandler Talks About content, there's a bunch of exclusives over on Patreon, including a companion video to this one where I talk about 5 more of the iconic horror franchises. You can find that at the link down below in the description, and let's get started. Number 6, George A. Romero's Dead franchise. With Night of the Living Dead, George A. Romero basically invented the concept of the zombie as we understand it, and the film subgenre of the zombie apocalypse film, and most of the tropes that you find in zombie movies and TV shows all the way up until today go back to that movie and what he did with that film, all about these people locked up in this house as the dead come back to life. And with each film in the franchise, instead of like doing sequels, trying to continue the characters, he very wisely decided to tell very different stories inside of this scenario. Jump forward 10 years, you get Dawn of the Dead, and it just takes everything up to the next level. You start to see society crumble, people head to the mall, so it's a much bigger scale, scope, and covers a longer period of time. You've got all of these gore effects from Tom Savini that were pretty groundbreaking for their time. And then just once again, this film created even more of the tropes that the zombie genre has been using ever since. Of course, you had Zack Snyder remake this film 30 years later, and I think he did a great job at it. Of course, laid the foundation for video games like Dead Rising. Jump forward a few years and he tells a very different story about people holed up at this military establishment. Jump forward another 20 years, you get Land of the Dead, and tells a story about kind of this colony that's been there for quite a while, learning to exist in a world with zombies in it. And of course, he did a couple films after that, but he kept reinventing his own franchises, making contributions to it, and invented this genre that's been wildly successful over the last 15 years, in particular with The Walking Dead. Number 5, the Conjuring franchise. I was actually pretty late to this series. I'm not the biggest fan of possession and exorcism films, so it didn't immediately appeal to me, but I kept hearing really great things about it. Eventually I checked it out, and I just loved what James Wan did with the main 2 Conjuring films, in particular because of the characters of the Warrens, that they feel like such normal people in this extraordinary world. They're likable, they feel like people you would know living down your street. They just happen to do exorcisms in their free time. And kind of even beyond that, the way that James Wan just transported us back 40 years into the past in the level of detail with the production design, the music that plays, the technology that you see all around them. You feel like you're in a different time and a different place. And then finally, he involved all of these practical effects with how these kind of things happen, and just looks more horrifying when you see a real person being dragged around and thrown. I love the way that he handled these films. Now, of course, there's a whole bunch of spin-offs in this franchise now that are of varying quality. Some of them are actually quite good. A couple of them total duds and stinkers, but it's a franchise where I'm still always optimistic when I hear a new film is coming out because I like the way that they handle this world. Number 4, the Child's Play or Chucky series. Even though I grew up during the 80s and 90s, this wasn't one of the horror franchises that I watched a lot during that time period, so I've more checked them out over the last few years, and I've thoroughly enjoyed them. One of the things I appreciate about this franchise is that it very much evolved over time. So the original trilogy of films leaned much more into direct horror, where you had Andy knowing something was wrong, adults didn't believe him, and then Chucky would kill people, and people are like, what's up with this kid? And there's always murder surrounding him. And then you kind of move into Bride of Chucky, and it moves in a much more comedic direction, much more stylized in the way things are visualized. And then it kept progressing as it went through. And while not all of the films and renditions were as successful as others, they all tried something new and different. Even in the last couple in the original series, kind of had a more artistic flair to the way certain things were done. They kept diving into the mythology and trying introducing new twists and turns into it that just kept it interesting. And even with the remake, a lot of people didn't like the direction they went with things. I think it works well enough on its own terms with what it's trying to be. So while this isn't one that I've necessarily been binging for the last 30 years, it is one that I've enjoyed over the last few. Real quick, before I give you my top 3, remember to share your favorite horror franchises down below in the comment section. My list is not the right list, it's just my list, and I would love to see yours. Also, remember there's a companion video to this over on my Patreon page where I discuss 5 more of the iconic horror franchises: Halloween, Freddy, The Purge, Saw, Final Destination. I talk about all of those over there. All of them have things I love about them. There's also reasons I didn't include them on this list. You can hear my thoughts in that companion video. In third place is Friday the 13th. In contrast to the Chucky series, I did grow up watching the Friday the 13th films late at night on cable TV, TNT, TBS. Whenever they would show up, I would try and check out a new one. So I watched them in all different orders. And Jason Voorhees has always been my favorite of the iconic, classic slasher killers from that era, largely because his movies were the ones that I watched the most back in the day. And because of the inherent nature of the franchise, of most of the movies having a very straightforward, simple premise about Jason showing up to kill a new batch of people, they're all very digestible slasher films for me. Even when they kind of went off the rails and got goofy and bad, they were a fun kind of goofy for me. In fact, going to go see Jason X in the theater with a bunch of my friends is one of my favorite memories from that time period, because it was just fun to watch such a dumb film. It's also just nice to see Jason in space killing people. Add to that, I had a lot of fun with Freddy vs. Jason, another movie I went to go see opening night with my friends. And of those remakes from about 12 years ago, by far the Friday the 13th remake was my favorite remake of that era. And I think a great addition to this franchise. I just think there's something about the simplicity of this franchise, whether it's Pamela or Jason Voorhees going off to Camp Crystal Lake to kill a bunch of counselors that want to do drugs in each other. There's something magical about that. So for me, this is one of my favorite of the slasher franchises. Our runner-up is the Evil Dead franchise. Back in the late 90s and early zeros, I basically watched the Raimi trilogy of these films on loop. I loved the character of Ash. Now, he starts off as a totally normal guy in the original film, and then he starts to kind of turn into this larger than life character in Evil Dead 2, and he cuts his hand off and attaches a chainsaw to it. Then you get to Army of Darkness, and he goes full action hero. Every line he delivers is a quotable one-liner.
Who wants some? Who's next? Good. Bad. I'm the guy with the gun.
This is my boomstick!
But just in general, Sam Raimi is obviously one of the great directors and storytellers of the last 40 years, and this was his horror franchise where he figured that all out, and he basically just kind of poured all of himself into these movies. And so whether that was a direct, straightforward horror film in the original one, or when you get to Army of Darkness, it's much more like this Three Stooges film jam-packed with comedy. This is who Sam Raimi is. It's his expression of himself combined with his buddy Bruce Campbell. Just such a delightful, fun, gruesome, horrifying horror franchise. But without question, in first place is the Scream franchise. I was in high school in the late 90s, so that Kevin Williamson era of self-referential horror slashers, those were my era of horror films, and the dominant franchise of that era was the Scream franchise, and I have just always loved these films. I think they work really well as slasher films, but they also work as kind of a send-up or deconstruction of the genre. They both are a love letter and a criticism of the dominant horror franchises of the previous 15 or 20 years or so. I think they also very wisely came up with this mechanism of the whodunit inside of it. And so instead of us knowing who the killer is as an audience, we're watching the movie just as curious, like what is going on as the audience. You kind of get that Scooby-Doo factor of the reveal at each one of the different films. Because of that, it just builds an extra layer of mystery and intrigue inside of each of the films. Likewise, they can be very funny at times in the way that they're so self-aware about what's going on and the stupid things that characters are doing in different films. Of course, the original film kicks off with just one of the classic horror movie openers with Drew Barrymore getting gutted right out of the gate inside of this film. And then just with each of the sequels, they found kind of a new direction to take things, especially in the second film. They were very wise in the way they made fun of horror sequels and that they tend to turn into these franchises. And then, of course, the stab movies inside of it. Just a bunch of really clever stuff. They always had great casts, especially when we come back 10 years later with Scream 4, they found a lot of just the right people to put into that movie to do some interesting stuff with it. So I have always loved these movies. I'm very excited to see what they're going to do with this Scream 5 coming out in a little bit over a year. So it comes in at number 1. All but one of the franchises we talked about in this video, I've actually done a ranking of the franchise in and of itself. You can find those in this playlist right over there, so you can hear my thoughts on each of the individual films. Which of the films inside of my favorite franchises do I enjoy the most? They're all right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.